You seem to be making yourself quite comfortable here, my boy.
I'm just trying to fit in.
By fighting? By making a nuisance of yourself? That is not the Bullworth way, boy.
Yeah, you could have fooled me.
What?
I said you could have fooled me. This place is full of bullies and maniacs.
Nonsense! That's just school spirit.
Bully was one of those games that instantly caught my attention when I first heard about it back in 2005. Grand Theft Auto 1 was the first game I'd ever played as a kid, and since then, GTA and open-world sandbox games have always held a special place for me. So when I heard Rockstar, the same developers who just released my all-time favorite Chaos sandbox, GTA San Andreas, were making a game set in a school, yeah, you can say I was pretty hyped. Nobody knew what to expect with this game because the concept seemed so out of left field. Unbeknownst to the public, Rockstar themselves weren't quite sure how to approach it, but the concept was just too unique to give up on. What we ended up getting was a passion project made with a lot of care put into it and a strong vision. A game whose appeal becomes self-evident to anyone who'd had any sort of childhood. A game that drew upon countless inspirations from television, film, and books, to the personal experiences of the developers themselves, and a common folklore unique to adolescence. What resulted was a game that was in equal measures unique but familiar, fresh but relatable. This is the crux of Bully's charm, and the thing that cemented this title as a cult classic. To experience the creative and captivating world of Bully and its unique cast of quirky characters, players got to pay a steep price today. Not in dollars, no, the game is cheap as hell now, but in time, patience, and commitment. For a first attempt at this sort of game, Rockstar Vancouver did an admirable job. They managed to hone in on an appropriate tone for the game and execute on a creative vision to truly make the player feel like they are a kid running around in the dysfunctional world of Bullworth. But like all first attempts, it's plagued by many rough edges. The mission structure, pulled almost entirely from previous Rockstar games, while being liberating enough for the developers to make their concepts into playable scenarios, obstructs a lot of the players' fun with tiring mechanics. The story, while praised for its creativity and charm, ultimately fails to create a cohesive narrative and feels like a jumbled mix of incomplete threads that compound with the disposable mechanics that are held within the missions. It had been a while since I'd played the game, and aside from some memorable cutscenes and frustrating missions, there wasn't much I could recall about Bully. Going back in a post-GTA 5 and Red Dead 2 era has been an interesting experience to say the least. For better or worse, Bully is a great example of textbook Rockstar open-world design, showing just how much and just how little they've grown over the years. All of these things are what we're going to be looking at here. There's going to be spoilers ahead, but unlike my usual videos that have them laced throughout, I'm going to segment the story to its own section that I'll warn you about if you want to skip it. First though, we gotta talk some development history, because the events surrounding Bully's development were, in typical Rockstar fashion, rife with controversy. Bully was developed by Rockstar Vancouver. Formerly known as Barking Dog Studios, they were responsible for developing a few expansions to established IPs before being acquired by Rockstar's publisher Take-Two Interactive in 2002. Bully would be their first game developed under the Rockstar banner, afterwards going on to assist with Max Payne 3 before ultimately being folded up and merged with Rockstar Toronto. Now, information on the development of Bully is a little sparse, mostly pieced together by the community over the years based off of a few sources and what can be deduced looking at game files. We'll talk about the beta builds of Bully in a second. The best main source I've been able to find is an interview with one of the lead designers, Mike Scupa, done by Eurogamer in 2019. In it, he described a tale of stressful development and long crunch hours owed to the pressure from Rockstar's New York offices, claims that seem to be a constant from just about every Rockstar production these days. Scupa also mentions how the team originally couldn't agree on the vision for the game. It wasn't until later in the development cycle things started to come together and the development team internally, as well as Vancouver and New York, were able to get on the same page. Initially, the game had a darker tone Scupa described as dog eat dog, until the team settled on the tone that found its way into the final product, which was much more lighthearted. This can be seen in very early promo material that stirred up a lot of controversy I'm honestly not going to get into here. These earlier concepts that had a rougher, cartoonish style seems to give off a grimy horror sort of vibe. Think of a tone landing between the real Bully and BioShock. Personally, I think they absolutely nailed the tone in the final product, though the beta material does make me wonder what a grittier Bully would have looked and played like. Files and bits of news seem to indicate Bully entered development somewhere around 2003, being developed on the same renderware engine Grand Theft Auto San Andreas used. Though, interestingly, there's residual files and references to Vice City in there, so it's possible Vice City's engine was used for earlier builds. Regardless, by March 2005, Rockstar officially announced the game, bringing it to E3 and targeting an October release that year. The game would ultimately get delayed by a year, finally releasing on PlayStation 2 in October 2006, with the original Xbox version getting scrapped altogether. Because of the delay, Bully released on the PlayStation 2 as the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 were right around the corner. As a result, only a couple years later, Rockstar would have Bully ported to both new consoles along with PC and the Wii, in the form of Bully Scholarship Edition. Advertised as a remaster, we'd consider it a port by today's standards. It boasted some new graphics, a few new classes for the player to attend, some new characters, and some new missions. It also came loaded with bugs and technical issues that required some patching that didn't solve much, and to this day, Scholarship Edition is a buggy, unstable version that's borderline unplayable on Windows 10. I don't know, is it time to start talking issues on PC? Yeah, I guess it's time. So if you go and buy Bully on Steam now and install it on a Windows 10 machine, you might make it about 5 minutes before a crash or an infinite loading screen. Sooner or later, you're probably gonna fall victim to it. There's a patch modders built that fixes this, and why Rockstar can't be bothered to make an actual official patch is beyond anyone's guess at this point. How games that can't even run are allowed to be sold on Steam is beyond anyone's guess at this point. But if you want to play it on PC, get the fan patch. You might also want the widescreen fix that fixes some FOV issues and allows you to uncap the frame rate of the game beyond 30 FPS. But both of these fixes introduces new issues like clipping and animation bugs. I opted for the widescreen fix, but kept the game locked at 30 FPS, which was an experience. So if you're wondering why this video is only in 30 FPS, there's your answer. After doing a few go-kart races, between the FPS and the choppy driving animations, my aging eyes just couldn't handle it and I had to go lie down afterwards because I was so dizzy. So be warned if you're like me and get motion sick easily. This game on PC is merciless on the eyes. There's also graphical mods and E&Bs that can make the game look a little nicer, but for the purity's sake of the video, I kept those out. Then there's the controls on the PC. Oh boy. You can remap a lot of the controls, but it's gonna mess with your menu controls, which are already weird. Your best bet is just plugging in an Xbox controller and using that. It has full controller support, and you're going to want to use it for the better movement and camera controls alone. You can use other gamepads like the PlayStation one, but you'll have to use a controller emulator to get it working. I don't have access to the 360 and PS3 versions, but apparently they're no bargain either, with lag, crashing, and lots of technical jank similar to the PC version. The Wii version is apparently not too bad because it uses the PS2 graphics, but it's on the Wii, so yeah. Even though the Scholarship Edition was touted as a remaster, it's clearly not up to snuff, and even as a direct port, it's not so great either, because there's parts of the game that are actually worse than the PS2 version. Particularly in the audio department, there's some crazy compression used on certain sound and music files that just garbles the hell out of the tracks, and makes them sound like they are coming from a PS1 game. I don't know how this happened, seeing as the PS2 version sounds fine. There's also some examples of lighting that was done better on the PS2, though for the most part, the graphics in the Scholarship Edition are better with improved textures, models, shadows, and draw distances. There's also a mobile version for iOS and Android, though it seems those versions don't receive any support now, considering the last update for the iOS version was to add full screen support for the iPhone X. They've still sold extremely well, especially on the Apple Store, where it's one of the most popular games in the adventure category. We'll get to talking about sales towards the end of the video, though. For now, I think it's time for us to move into what this game is actually about. People have taken to calling this game Grand Theft Auto but in school, and that's a very surface level take that I don't particularly subscribe to. It might make for a serviceable shorthand sales pitch, but there's a lot more we get with Bully that we don't get in GTA, and vice versa. It's an open world sandbox game that explores darker subjects in modern society, and it's made with the same engine, but that's about where a lot of the design similarities end. To get a good sense of the gameplay mechanics, it's best to look at things in a linear fashion of a typical day for Jimmy. Things start with him getting out of bed in his dorm room at 8 in the morning. The dorm room is one of several safe locations we will get access to over the course of the game. It's here we can save the game, change our clothes, use our chemistry set to restock our weapons, and of course sleep. The sleep mechanic is the first thing different from GTA, and it's really what sets the pace for the whole game and creates a lot more structure than you'd find in a GTA game. Jimmy has a curfew of 11 PM, but he can be out until 2 AM before he passes out from exhaustion. I assume we get this hard limit on when the day ends because we have set classes that we have to attend each day at set times. It might be an intended design choice to give each day distinct structure, or it could be a necessity for scripting an AI, or it could be for a different reason entirely. I can't really tell for sure. All I know is it's an often overlooked mechanic, usually only getting a brief mention that it exists, but I think it's actually one of the more unique parts of Bully's design that works very well. With its inclusion, automatically time becomes a resource we need to manage. Between going to classes, getting missions and side tasks done, messing around, traveling, and of course sleeping, we have a lot we want and need to get done and only so many hours to do it. Whether it was intended or not, this reminds me of my childhood when I always had to plan in order to maximize my waking minutes for playing games. Bully had me trying to optimize and budget my time in a similar way and plan my days out so I could get what I really wanted to do done. The developers have said how they wanted to recreate the feeling of being a kid, and this being a slave to a schedule I have no control over definitely struck a chord. There's going to be players that hate it, find it tedious, and wish it was removed. There's also going to be players who didn't think much about it because it's easy to fall into a routine with the game. Bully is generous with how much time we get in a day and how long missions take. Some missions will even pause time, while things like classes will skip time because classes always let out at a specific time of day. It reminds me of games like Stardew Valley, where time management is an actual component of the gameplay loop, and managing time is a skill the player needs to develop. In Bully, it's not as integral and doesn't require as much thought, but it's still something that requires consideration most days. If a mission is given by a fellow student, chances are you can't start those missions during class hours. This can actually get a little confusing because there will be times in a day where your map is completely empty of mission markers, only for 4 of them to pop up come 3:30 PM. This could have been mitigated by having the map marker just be grayed out and the start point tell you to come back at certain hours, because some of those times are a lot more obtuse. For example, I remember one mission wouldn't start until like 6 or 7 at night, and that wasn't apparent when it would disappear from my map come the morning. So Jimmy is up by 8 and his first class is at 9:30. We are free to start a mission right then and there, but this probably means we are going to be cutting class, and truancy, just like violating curfew, is a violation of school rules. This means we are going to have the prefects and police chasing after us if they catch sight of us. But this isn't a serious enough infraction to have them hunt us down, so giving the authority a little distance is enough to let us play hooky. So the morning bell rings at 9 and we have a half hour to haul ass to class. Fortunately, Jimmy has the speed of a cruising car and the stamina of a horse, so he can bolt across the campus in record time. Getting to the gym was always a pain though, and I was always late. Fortunately, showing up late doesn't incur any penalties. You can show up 2 minutes before the class lets out and still knock everything out and pass for the day. In the base game, we had 6 classes. Chemistry in the morning and English in the afternoon of day 1, art and gym on day 2, and shop and photography on day 3. Though photography is a little weird and requires the player to be past a certain point in the story to unlock it. In Scholarship Edition, we get 4 more classes, giving us 5 days total. The schedule gets shuffled and thus becomes chemistry and English, art and gym, biology and music, shop and photography, and finally geography and math. There are no weekends, a missed opportunity in my opinion, and something I hope they add in a sequel. So once the final day is complete, it loops back and starts again. This means if you miss a class, it's going to be a few days before you see it again. By the time I finished the story, I only completed 3 classes, and some of them, like photography, I'd only had twice. In the original game on the PS2, I remember having all the classes done by the end of the story, but I did rush the story this time around, so your mileage may vary how far you get in classes. Not that it's a big deal, even at the end of the game, they keep going. And once you complete a class, you don't have to show up to class anymore. Although you can if you really like the minigame for some reason. As you can tell from the footage I've been playing for a while now, these classes are nothing but simple minigames that are meant to allude to their subjects in some form or another. They're, something. I'm not a fan of minigames. Even in modern Bethesda titles where things like lockpicking have been replaced by a minigame, I tolerate them as best I can and try to find ways to speed through them or circumvent them entirely. More often than not, they just feel like time sinks. Something that exists to slow the game down and present an abstraction of a much more complex process. In the case of the classes, that's exactly what they are. It works to some extent here better than in games like Skyrim because, at least in real life, school often feels like a total waste of time to kids, which jives well with Bullies' design goals. But after doing the same minigame 5 or more times because I might have flunked a class for the day and had to repeat it, yeah, it gets old really fast and makes me wish I could just skip the minigame and still get the bonuses at the end. Each class gives unique rewards. Gym gives new fighting moves and improved accuracy with the slingshot. English gives you better apologies and taunts to use to defuse and escalate confrontations. Art gives health bonuses to kissing girls, or the one gay bully, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, the only worthwhile bonuses are from the original classes. The ones added in the Scholarship Edition only reward the player with unique clothing items that frankly look dumb. The one exception being Geography, which reveals collectibles on the map, which is an awesome intrinsic reward. I just don't know why music couldn't unlock bonus music tracks, or Biology upgrading Jimmy's melee damage from him learning about anatomy or something. There's really not much worse in this game than having to endure the music classes just to get some ugly shirt. All in all, though, the classes are about as good as they could be given the scope of the game. What I mean by that is, I believe Bully 2 would benefit from ditching the minigame design concept altogether for the classes, and instead focus on building better character modifiers for them so that the player is much more compelled to do them. We already lose in-game time in the day from completing the classes, so is it really necessary to waste the player's time too? It's not like these are super challenging and the consequences for passing or failing aren't going to make or break the progression. In the end, classes are really just there to sell us on the whole school experience, and for that purpose, they do a good job. We got a gap between the morning and afternoon class if we feel like taking a mission and skipping the afternoon class. Otherwise, come 3:30, we are turned loose with the rest of the day at our disposal. There's missions we can go complete, or we can go tackle side tasks like challenges, bike races, finding collectibles, completing errands, getting part-time jobs, doing a little shopping, or just wandering around, goofing off, exploring, and causing mayhem in the sandbox. Now, I could go through and explain each of these in more detail, but honestly, most of them are self-explanatory in what you'd expect. Things like the bike races are only worth noting for their terrible AI opponents that will cheat with the most egregious rubber banding I have ever seen in a game. But other than that, it's what you'd expect, and honestly not very fun unless you enjoy rhythmically tapping the A button on your controller for a few hours. So let's look at missions. Don't worry, no spoilers yet. In a lot of ways, the missions resemble the classes in that they often involve some sort of minigame or gameplay gimmick. Only these are even less developed than the class minigames, and a majority of the time you'll never see these gimmicks again once the mission is complete. This is textbook Rockstar mission design. A design philosophy that has found its way into all their sandbox games from GTA 3 all the way into Red Dead 2, and I've never been impressed by it. I'm gonna say something here that's bound to piss off a few people, but hear me out. Rockstar is terrible at making missions in their open world games. It's strange to think that, considering they are arguably masters of open world sandbox game design, but when it comes time to put up the fences and make something more focused in their worlds, they often struggle with infuriatingly restrictive mission designs that will have some absurd game over messages like these from Red Dead 2. Rockstar's mission designs can be broken down into 4 different components: cutscenes, traveling, combat, and world interaction. The first three they're usually pretty solid with, but that last one is almost always lacking in some way because Rockstar just isn't consistently good at making mechanics that allow the player to interact with their worlds. Sometimes they find something that can fit, like hunting in Red Dead, but more often than not, the only way players can interact with the world is through violence. And that's because Rockstar is a lot more skilled at making combat mechanics than other mechanics. Unfortunately, missions that are non-stop combat can and will get monotonous, so Rockstar needs to have something other than fighting for the player to do in missions. This results in them having to lean on other mechanics in their games, which means they either have to choose between something tried and true like racing, or something the designers just formulated on the spot. If it's not enjoyable, well, the player will never see it again anyways. This allows Rockstar to make missions that have the player engaging in more diverse tasks, which can greatly expand what Rockstar can make missions centered around. The problem is that this usually just means more minigames, and like I said, I'm not a fan of minigames. And the best I think people can say about the minigames found in most Rockstar titles is that they are unobtrusive. I've never seen someone go out of their way to praise how great it was getting to play a makeshift tower defense game and brief QuickTime events. It's fine for these to exist because they can help create that immersion of being a kid in this town, which is why Rockstar added these missions and minigames to begin with, but the problem is that almost all of the missions have them. Most of my favorite missions in this game were combat missions because combat was the clear focus for the team, so it's more fleshed out. Likewise, combat exists in the sandbox outside of the missions, so doing missions might expose me to new ways of performing combat, or failing that, just make me better and more comfortable with it. That's the beauty of missions in a game like this. It allows Rockstar to introduce and reinforce mechanics and tools the player can then use in the free roam sandbox after the mission is complete, unless that mechanic is just there for the one mission and then is dumped and never seen again. Ultimately, the failure lies in Rockstar's inability to come up with more mechanics, or flesh out their main mechanics enough so that they can carry entire missions. I'm not going to beat on the Vancouver team too hard here because they were a tiny team working on something truly unique here, and the GTA model was not going to be able to be carried over one-to-one. What I will say is that they weren't doing themselves any favors by designing missions where the concepts came first, as opposed to designing missions where the mechanics were laid out first. Let me explain. The developers stated how they wanted to make the game feel like you're a kid back in school. Okay, makes sense. They also stated how their missions are meant to reflect that feeling, and here's where the problems begin. If you design a mission where the leading question is, how do we make a mission that involves egging houses because that's what kids do, as opposed to, okay, how do we have the player interact with these three game mechanics, you're going to box yourself into a different design mindset. It's like building a house. Do I start with the exterior and make the insides fit the contours of the building, or do I make a floor plan and wrap the exterior's design around that? Both are valid approaches, but both involve making often exclusionary decisions that are going to make other options invalid. This is what I believe the Vancouver team accidentally did to themselves by constantly asking, how do we recreate this iconic childhood thing? We do need a lot of missions that ask that, but we also needed a few missions that go, okay, what does this game mechanically do well, and how can we make a mission that plays to those strengths? I can't definitively say nobody at Rockstar followed design philosophy B, but when you got a bunch of devs saying how they did philosophy A, it leads me to conclude B was not often picked. All of this is to say the missions in Bully very rarely connect with what the game does well mechanically, resulting in a whole lot of boring, frustrating, and tedious missions whose premises are their only saving grace. As a result, missions feel like grab bags of ideas that just never quite feel like they are meshing together, and come across as filler to justify us playing through Jimmy's adolescent hijinks. I keep mentioning combat, so let's get deeper into that. Like I said, it was clearly a focus for the team, and with good reason. They couldn't exactly model Bully's combat off of GTA because a game that involves kids shooting each other is, probably water they don't want to be treading. This required them to find more palatable forms of violence the player could engage in, which resulted in a melee-focused system.
You don't want to touch me! My smell is contagious! Step back! You'll learn to like it!
piece of crap! Die!
My tender soul! Run!
Do you think anyone saw?
Buzz off! Come on, Pansy! Enjoy visiting your family!
This isn't some sophisticated combo-heavy game like Street Fighter or Yakuza, but it's definitely a lot more than what we'd seen from Rockstar before Bully and since. Jimmy starts with only knowing a simple right swing mapped to a single button on the controller. He can also grapple to perform a few more moves and toss opponents about, perform finisher bullying moves, and when the player locks onto an enemy, Jimmy automatically puts his guard up to block, making the combat a lot easier with no need to time blocks. Over the course of the game, Jimmy will unlock more moves from gym class and a homeless war vet living behind the school. These introduce very simple button combos like double tap and then hold to perform a leg sweep, and a takedown when grappling opponents. These moves eventually transform Jimmy into a kid with a bulldozer fist and is essential for fighting the larger, older, and stronger opponents later in the game. He can also pick up items scattered throughout the world like bats, planks, paddles, trash can lids, fire extinguishers, and bricks which he can use to whack people with, throw down range, or in the case of the fire extinguisher, spray people with to stun them. You can't store these items for later, but you'll find them quite regularly during the missions, and they can come in quite handy during the early game. Unfortunately, there's no way to scale Jimmy's physical strength, so the damage he does with a bat in the beginning is the same at the end, making these tools less effective later on. Then we get into fully ranged items like the slingshot Jimmy acquires from a mission very early on. This is sort of a multi-tool for Jimmy, which he can also use to whittle targets down from afar, and thanks to how fast Jimmy can sprint, staying out of melee range of enemies and taking pot shots with the slingshot is definitely a viable strategy. It can also be used to alert enemies, break objects, and just be a general nuisance with. Over the course of the game, he'll gain access to more and more tools that the player can switch to at any moment, such as stink bombs, itching powder, firecrackers, eggs, marbles, a bottle rocket launcher, and even a spud cannon near the very end of the game. All of these have unique use case scenarios and all feel very well balanced and distinct that leave none of them feeling superfluous. Granted, things like itching powder and stink bombs prove less effective on the bigger targets, but still handy in a pinch. The player can find these items all over the map, during missions, in shops, even in trash cans and cardboard boxes. They can also be replenished by the chemistry set in the save locations, and completing chemistry classes will unlock more items. I honestly can't say enough good things about these sorts of tools. It's clear a lot of time and care went into their designs to blend them seamlessly with the setting, while also making them actually useful. Before leaving combat though, we should talk difficulty. That is to say, the lack thereof. This game was designed to be played by a wide range of players, and a steep difficulty curve would have cut some people off from experiencing the more compelling parts of Bully. As a result, enemy AI just isn't all there, and moves and tools they have access to are also equally not as extensive. As you get further in the game, you'll face beefier opponents who can put out a lot more damage while shrugging off your attacks and will counter grapples more readily, but they don't get smarter. They don't try baiting the player into attacking, and they don't have memorable attack patterns. They're more reactive to the player than proactive, and it makes it so that the player is often the one dictating the tempo of a fight, even if they are being outnumbered. There's occasional boss fights to cap off each story chapter. With a couple of exceptions, they really don't require the player to switch things up and try new tactics, or even utilize more than a couple of moves and tools in their extensive arsenal. I found myself switching things up just to keep things from getting stale. There's a lot of tried and true strategies that can be universally applied to almost every fight, and the AI will never recognize the player falling into a pattern and try to exploit that. Also, AI can't climb, but Jimmy can, resulting in a lot of opportunities to just cheese things. Between the easy AI and lenient checkpoints, it can get dull once you're done unlocking everything and found your go-to combat formula. The incentive to experiment just isn't quite there, though thankfully there aren't any disincentives either. AI is a good transition into talking about rule breaking and punishments. There's a lot more rules to this game as opposed to GTA, where you can get away with just about anything so long as you aren't actively killing NPCs. In Bully, you can get trouble for just standing still. No, seriously, if you're not in your school uniform, you might gain the ire of the prefects. Fortunately, this is the most mild infraction that will just trigger a verbal warning from the prefect before they turn around and continue with their patrol. More serious infractions include theft, bullying, assault, graffiti, harassment, pulling the fire alarm, the list goes on. There's so many rules that I found a new one the other day when I blocked a cop chasing someone and got hit with something like obstructing the law. Depending on how many rules Jimmy breaks and how severe they are, the prefects, cops, and teachers will pursue Jimmy with an appropriate level of vigor. If he just called a kid a mean word, the prefects might outright ignore him. But if he goes up, gives a prefect a wedgie, and then kicks him in the balls, yeah, he's gonna get chased down for that one. Once the prefects are on the chase, you can use Jimmy's super speed to outrun the slower adults, break their line of sight, and find a hiding spot until the heat cools down, usually a few seconds after breaking line of sight. They might go on the hunt a little while longer, but once the meter next to the minimap depletes, all is forgiven. Jimmy doesn't accumulate a bounty or anything. I guess everyone just subscribes to the boys will be boys mentality here. If Jimmy gets caught, he can sometimes perform a quick time event to break free, or he'll get tackled to the ground and officially busted. This will usually just involve respawning at the principal's office or a police station with all his weapons confiscated, but if he gets busted enough times in a row, he will get sent to detention. This is actually one of the more enjoyable minigames, as strange as that sounds, because it's literally meant to waste your time to punish you for getting caught. Jimmy can either get stuck mowing the lawns around campus, or shoveling banks of snow if it's winter and there's no grass to touch. The more detention sentences he serves, the longer the sentences get and the bigger the lawns get, until he literally has to mow the entire football field. It takes a lot to get busted that often, so you really gotta earn that punishment, but I find it entirely appropriate and surprisingly cathartic to make all the tall grass get deleted. The lawnmower controls like total balls though, completely unlike a real ride mower, but that's part of the charm here, I suppose. Evading the prefects and the cops is really no big to do. Like I said, Jimmy can outrun all the adults, and it's really only when you get cut off by another prefect as you're being chased by two others that you're gonna find things getting tricky. Speaking of evasion, I'd like to real quickly touch on how Jimmy can navigate the world. Aside from Jimmy's super speedy sprint, he also gets access to a skateboard, which is a neat little toy, but could have used more attention. All Jimmy can do with it, aside from ride it, is pop an ollie and do some spins. Tony Hawk Pro Skater this ain't. I also am not convinced the skateboard is literally the same movement speed as sprinting. So, coupled with the wonky camera controls, this can be a recipe for getting stuck on walls and obstacles due to no fault of your own, making it in fact slower than if you just ran. We also don't get access to any other skateboards, so Jimmy is stuck with the same scuffed up board the entire game. The same can't be said about bikes, which have a lot more to them than the skateboard. Jimmy gets access to quite a few of them over the course of the game. Shop class will unlock progressively better bikes, which will have better stats for things like speed, handling, and jump height. We can also unlock more either by buying them from the shops or from completing races. It would have been neat to see some customization options for bikes, allowing us to spec them to different uses and, of course, alter their appearances, but they came out well for the first attempt. They control well enough and we are free to use certain weapons on them for added fun, but like the skateboard, we can't do much in the way of tricks. Jimmy could bunny hop with them and perform some spins, but once again, this isn't a BMX game. Jimmy can't even pop wheelies, which is kinda strange, seeing as CJ could do it in San Andreas, once again leading me to my theory this game isn't using the exact same engine. There's also a couple of unique vehicles like a scooter, a go-kart, and the aforementioned lawnmower, but they're all tied to specific challenges and missions. The biggest gripe I got with the bike system is that it's very easy to lose track of your bike and have it disappear on you, forcing you to run around town and defeating the purpose of having the bike. They will infinitely respawn at a nearby bike garage, but it's always a pain having to hoof it to the nearest garage because a townie decided to 5-finger discount your bike while you were hunting for a collectible. We're not exactly done talking about mechanics, but to really get into the remaining few, I gotta introduce the world and the characters proper, so let's do that. When we start the game, we're restricted to the campus of Bullworth Academy, but as we progress the story, more of the map opens up. The first to open up are Bullworth Town and Old Bullworth Vale, as well as the adjacent carnival. Then there's New Coventry, which is a developed but run-down part of town where the train runs through with many apartment buildings and homeless. Attached to that is Blue Skies Industrial Park, which also houses a trailer park where the poorest of Bullworth live. There's also Happy Volt's mental asylum, which we don't see much of aside from a couple of missions. A shame because it's a unique and very spooky setting that surprisingly complements the rest of the game. The campus itself is also quite large respective to the rest of the map due to the level of detail and the number of buildings we're free to enter and explore. The campus has what you'd expect for a boarding school: a main building, 2 dorms separated based on gender, a library, a gym, a football field, a car shop, and a social club for the preppy students called Harrington Hall. These are the main areas for the students, but there's also a basement part of the main building, an empty pool that is only used as a backdrop for a couple of missions, and an old run-down observatory the nerds use as their secret fortress. The campus feels weathered and old, rich in detail and character that's enjoyable to explore and look at. But so many areas of the map go very underutilized except to act as locations for their respective cliques to spawn and mill about in. Bullworth feels like any number of nondescript small New England towns the region is meant to resemble, urban decay and all. There's different shops around town, mostly clustered in Bullworth and Old Vale. These shops include general goods stores, a bike shop, barbers, and clothing stores. There's also a few notable locations like the movie theater, the boxing gym, a fast food joint, a comic book store, and many others that several missions and tasks will take us to. The streets are often alive with adults and kids alike wandering around going about their business. These aren't Bethesda Radiant AI NPCs, so these ones just spawn in and walk around to act as window dressing as opposed to having routine AI packages that have them adhering to schedules. What I always found jarring was seeing some kids on campus and then hopping on my bike and heading into town only to see those exact kids now wandering the streets in town. There's no way they got there that quickly, and it's one of those Rockstar engine quirks that can dampen the illusions needed to keep players fully immersed in the world. The other problem is that New Coventry, the Industrial Park, and the Carnival are all woefully underutilized. The Carnival only pops up in a couple of missions, which seems strange because it seems like that would be the place for kids to hang out and get up to no good. New Coventry and Blue Skies also just suffer from a lack of missions in general. Their respective story chapters are brief, leaving a lot of their maps unused. Blue Skies especially. The area is large and detailed, but aside from picking up some collectibles, you're likely to never see most of it. If you take a second to stop and really look at the environments and the characters, you're going to start to pick up on something ominous about Bullworth as a town. Everywhere you look, there's dirt, trash, and crumbling buildings. Everything looks neglected and well beyond their intended lifespan. Even old Bullworth Vale doesn't seem that nice, it's just more put together than the rest of the region. This extends to the campus where everything is dumpy and breaking down. Everyone's complaining all the time about how trashy the place is. I've come to think the worst school in the country might have been an intentional design choice to explain why Jimmy can run around causing so much mayhem and suffer very little consequences as a result. Maybe this is why nobody chases Jimmy for long, because crime is so pervasive in Bullworth. If that's the case, then is it any wonder why these kids are all dysfunctional when the adults can't even be bothered to keep the streets and school clean? It plays to a certain ironic tone the entire game is laced with, because when you think of media revolving around childhood, they usually have a reverent nostalgia to them. Bully takes a completely different approach by removing the rose tint and replacing it with a brown one. It might be a more realistic and relatable tone, but it's definitely more muted and depressing. That doesn't keep Bully from feeling like a product of love and nostalgia though, and it's that dichotomy that I think helped make the world of Bully stick and remain so captivating and memorable. Very little about the world feels antiquated, and this is what everyone means when they say the game feels timeless. Personally, I think the game has a late 80s to late 90s feel, but then there's computers with flat LCD screens, so who can say for certain. The distinct lack of smartphones and post-2008 Apple-inspired vapid minimalism definitely keeps the setting alienated from today, but it does still carry enough ambiguity to keep its world from landing in a definite decade. Speaking of ambiguity, despite the grimy and grounded style of the world, Rockstar stops way short of ever using Bully to make any sort of social statement, even if that's where all this seems to be leading towards. The game is so set in its ambivalence that it makes it very hard to tell if it was just a result of so many different ideas being put into the game, or if it was a genuine overarching choice to keep the game as relatable as possible. I could definitely see them not wanting to inject too much social commentary into this game. After all, they had enough controversy before the game even shipped, and getting political with its material might have caused even more controversies. I'll go into this a little more when we talk story, but don't expect any sort of commentary on classism, violence, crime, abuse, and dysfunctional households out of Bully. Inhabiting this world, we got the various cliques that form the social hierarchy of Bullworth. These all follow the well-worn path of stereotypes pop culture has laid down with zero deviation, and that's not exactly a criticism. First we got the bullies. These guys float around the common grounds of the school and the parking lot, picking on the weakest students, oftentimes getting sat on by prefects as punishment for their behavior. Then we got the nerds who hang around the library and the main school building, mostly getting bullied and complaining how bad the school is. Then there's the preps who hang around Harrington Hall. They're less often targets of bullying, but they're still weak enough to get picked on. Likewise, they will do a little bullying of their own. Then there's the greasers who hang around the auto shop. Nobody really messes with them, and they'll often ignore Jimmy and anyone else unless they wander onto their turf. Finally, there's the jocks who almost exclusively hang around the gym. You'll almost never see them anywhere else, especially in the school building itself. They are the most territorial and will chase down anyone who gets near the gym or football field. Technically, there's one more clique, and that's the townies. These guys are dropouts and rejects from Bullworth who are mostly too old to even attend school anymore and now live in the trailer park. Since they don't have a presence on campus, they aren't really a clique, but they're certainly a faction that we end up crossing paths with during the story. Speaking of non-cliques, there's also a whole host of students who aren't affiliated with any clique, most of them just acting as bait for bullying. Jimmy ends up having no interactions with any of these characters during the course of the story. A lot went into making each clique feel unique, from their appearances and associated locations to their behaviors and roles in the game. As a result, they are very easy to tell apart from one another when they're mingling in school. This is beneficial because there's different things you can expect from members of each clique. Like I said, the jocks and greasers can be very aggressive towards anyone, including Jimmy, while the nerds can be safely ignored or bullied. The problem with this approach is that it diminishes a lot of the individuality of each kid NPC. Rockstar made a valiant effort with trying to make every student at Bullworth, all 61 of them, unique characters with their own distinct appearances, voices, backstories, and behaviors. A lot of players praise the game for having unique, memorable characters as a result, and I think that praise is warranted up to a point. Because Rockstar made the clique so on the nose with their stereotypes, every student that belongs to a clique is forced to have their personalities be mined from similar nodes. It may seem pedantic to point out how every single one of them wears glasses, but that's the level of stereotyping we're dealing with here. If you go on the wiki and read about each nerd, you're going to find a lot of entertaining information, but unless you're stalking each character in the hallways listening to the ambient lines they voice every so often, you're forced to take each character at face value. It seems strange every NPC in the game will walk around muttering all their deepest thoughts and secrets loud enough for someone 30 feet away to hear, but that was really the only solution open to Rockstar to get the point across that each character is unique. So aside from being stereotyped into a clique, all the students also share the same habit of talking to themselves. I'm not saying the game is worse for having the students be unique, but I wouldn't have minded if they threw in a bunch of generic nerds or jocks who just kept their mouths shut unless talking to other NPCs. I get there's only so many NPCs they can stick on screen with the PS2, but if a Bully 2 happens, I really hope they add way more generic students who just act as a backdrop for the others, so not every character in the game seems to possess the same nervous tick. I also hope individual characters get promoted out of the silly stereotype rut almost every character in this game are stuck in. We get to interact with a few notables from each clique, like Algie and Ernest, but rather than using their precious screen time to establish them as something more than their respective stereotypes, Rockstar instead uses the time to reinforce those stereotypes for comedic effect. We'll get into the one-dimensional characters of the story in just a bit. I first want to talk about Jimmy. Jimmy is the most developed character in the game by virtue of having the most screen time and being the protagonist. He's unaffiliated with any one clique, seeming to be apathetic towards the whole social hierarchy of the school, and in the beginning of the game that paints him as a target for bullying by all the other cliques. This introduces the faction reputation system, which acts a lot like how many other games deal with reputations. If Jimmy is on bad terms with the clique, they're going to bully and attack him. If they like him, they will either ignore him or even appreciate his presence and come to defend him when he's in trouble. It's a very simple system, but my real gripe with it is that we the player have zero control over it. We can't have Jimmy affiliate with a clique, we can't have him do things to earn reputation with them, we have no input on the system at all because reputation only goes up and down a fixed amount at the end of story missions. We do a mission, and depending on who that mission is for and who we might be screwing over during the mission, the reputation will be adjusted accordingly. We don't even get a warning for who might be made happy or angry by our actions before we take a mission. The whole premise of the story is about trying to get the cliques to stop fighting and get Jimmy to the top of the Bullworth food chain. But it's such an up and down ride with the reputation that at one point the story literally zeroes out Jimmy's reputation with every faction. As a result, reputation is completely worthless to monitor, even though the game does keep track of it and show us it in the menu and at the end of each mission. What we do get control over is Jimmy's appearance. I mentioned earlier how there's a dress code for Bullworth and we are free to violate it with virtually no consequences. A lot of players like to complain about the dress code and say that's why you should keep Jimmy in his school uniform, but I don't know why. I've never been chased or busted for a school uniform. As a result, I like to keep Jimmy's lack of style fresh and rotate through various outfits that I assembled from clothes I bought from different shops around town. Amusingly enough, some of my favorite clothes are sold by the school and sport the name and the logo, but for some reason I'd still get nailed for the dress code. Yeah, I don't really get that one. On a somewhat related note, Mr. Luntz, who runs the shop, is also an interesting character I've never seen people mention. Mr. Luntz is also the school janitor, and in a game full of twisted, unhinged freaks, this dude's gotta take the cake.
They should be kept in chains in the basement. Yeah, it would do them
No
good.
need for complex reasons where a simple beating will do.
In fact, a lot of the faculty has some underlying problems. The prefects all seem like bloodthirsty maniacs who openly brag about how much they enjoy busting troublemakers. The English teacher, Mr. Galloway, teaches drunk. The math teacher, Mr. Hattrick, is a douche who plays politics and sells good grades to the rich students. The cafeteria cook is a literal mess. The gym teacher is a predator. The principal's secretary practically worships him and is alluded to having a relationship with him. And the principal himself, Dr. Crabblesnitch, is an insufferable narcissist with a messiah complex. The kids seem like a terrible bunch, but a lot of the faculty seem like they ought to be in prison, not running a school. This goes back to that ambivalent tone Rockstar was going for. Taken on their own, the faculty paints the school in a very dark and sinister tone. But thanks to the silly tone elsewhere in the game, that ends up rubbing off on the faculty and just makes them larger-than-life caricatures that seem to only exist to antagonize the kids like most adults in kids' lives. The only other truly noteworthy characters aside from Jimmy and the principal is Petey and Gary. Both of them are initially presented as Jimmy's only friends at Bullworth, and in the case of Petey, that remains the same. But in Gary's case, plot and character development starts to happen, and this is where we are going to switch gears and finally talk story. As promised, I'm going to include a story summary skip here. If you want to avoid major spoilers or just don't feel like listening to a recounting of events, skip to the timestamp on screen now. I'll give you a second. So right off the bat, the first cutscene shows Jimmy mouthing off to his mom and her new husband on the car ride to Bullworth. The game wastes no time showing how impudent and crude Jimmy can be, and it's an effective setup for Jimmy's trademark bastard with a heart of gold personality that all Rockstar game protagonists possess. He starts the game driving his mother nuts, but once she drives off, he says this.
Mom, why'd you marry that phony? What is wrong with you? I can't believe this.
Making me wonder if everything he just said was out of anger and not because Jimmy is just another asshole. Jimmy's relationship with his mom is never fully explained, but it's never forgotten either. She sends Jimmy a picture of her and Jimmy's new stepdad on their honeymoon and even sends him an ugly sweater for Christmas. There's just enough of a relationship there to help explain Jimmy's aggression and also his motivation, because you'd think Jimmy wouldn't care about being expelled from Bullworth, but he does. Throughout the story, he'll state such, and during a cutscene later in the game when Crabblesnitch says he's going to contact Jimmy's mom, Jimmy reacts surprisingly strongly, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. The story is structured into 5 chapters, with all of them being focused on a certain clique and central conflict. The first chapter is Jimmy's first few weeks at Bullworth, getting used to the way things go there, and more importantly, getting to know the cliques and the major players. It's really just a bunch of tutorial missions, but unlike most games that have to contrive ways to explain why the character doesn't know something so the player can be introduced to it, Bully always has the natural reasoning of Jimmy is new to the school to explain all of this away. The reasoning is so valid that the tutorialization seems relevant to the narrative. He's new and it's school, so of course someone is going to be lecturing Jimmy almost all the time. Although I will say certain mechanics like going to the store didn't need a mission to explain how you can go and buy new clothes and get a haircut, which actually comes in Chapter 2. In fact, a lot of tutorial missions continue to pop up well into Chapter 2, which, by then, most players will have already put in a few hours and know how to play the game. A new mechanic by then doesn't need its own tutorial mission for the player's sake. A pop-up box explaining would suffice, or just opening the mechanic up and letting the player figure it out for themselves. Anyways, the first chapter mostly involves Jimmy and his new friends Gary and Pete. Gary is presented as the opposite of Jimmy. He's someone who revels in the suffering of others and endlessly goes out of his way to screw with people, as opposed to Jimmy, who just gives it to people who deserves it, according to the cutscenes anyway. We'll get to talking about shit like ludonarrative dissonance in a second, just bear with me before this segment turns into Tangent City. Gary immediately comes across as an untrustworthy social pariah as his malevolence extends all the way to Pete. Pete is the most normal, well-adjusted member of this school, just a little socially awkward. Because of that, he doesn't fit in with a clique and is the least popular kid in school as a result. Ironic, because he's an audience favorite due to his level-headedness and loyalty throughout the game. Gary always stops just short of turning hostile on Jimmy because he knows Jimmy wouldn't put up with his shit for very long, and Gary has use of Jimmy. Gary is a necessary fixture of the story, so the designers could give the players the opportunity to play out many of those iconic childhood moments they wanted to build the bully experience around. Over the course of the beginning act, he sends Jimmy out to perform his often mild pranks, such as Halloween when he has Jimmy set fire to a bag of dog poop outside of the faculty room. The game then begins tossing the nerds into the mix, and we get a few missions helping them, such as the mission where Jimmy is paid to act as security for the head nerd so he can give his campaign speech for student president. Unfortunately, a lot of these missions have no real bearing on the world. We never find out if Ernest gets to be class president, it just gets tossed aside and forgotten about like so many of the disposable gameplay mechanics we get introduced to in the missions. Jimmy isn't fond of doing Gary's bidding, considering he's trying not to get expelled from another school, leading to a lot of tension before coming to a head during the final mission of the chapter. Gary brings Jimmy down to the pit in the basement of the school where he has Russell, the biggest bully in the school, fight Jimmy. Russell is our first boss fight and is about as simple as a boss fight can get, only requiring the player to beat on Russell longer than any other opponent as of yet. There's no gimmick to exploit here, just mash buttons and avoid his wide attacks until Russell hits the floor. Gary reveals himself to be the treacherous snake we all knew him to be, and explains how he'd never be friends with a loser like Jimmy. Gary wants to be the top of the food chain and control all the cliques, and even though Jimmy repeatedly explains how he doesn't care about any of that, Gary sees Jimmy as a threat and needs to neutralize him by humiliating him in front of the assembled students. Gary's plan doesn't make a whole lot of sense because would Jimmy losing a fight to this game's version of the Hulk really lead to Jimmy losing face? As well, this is only a fraction of the student body. This isn't going to be that much of a public humiliation. It's unlikely Jimmy losing here would have the result Gary intended, unless he was hoping Russell would put Jimmy in the hospital and take him out of the picture quite literally. The biggest problem with Gary's plan is what would happen if Jimmy won the fight. Surely he'd win the respect and admiration of the entire student body, and oh, that's exactly what happens. Jimmy whips Russell, and now Jimmy has the bully faction permanently on his side because Russell respects him. In fact, it works so well that the bullies will remain on Jimmy's side the entire rest of the game, even when every other faction turns on him in the final chapter. For now, Gary's plans have been foiled and he disappears from the story, though Jimmy, Pete, and the audience knows he isn't gone for good. Chapter 2 begins and autumn is now upon Bullworth. The town opens up to the player and the next set of missions take place almost entirely off campus. The preps are the clique of focus in this chapter, but in truth, they're only a part of the story for a fraction of the chapter. Some of the characters act as participants, and their part of town acts as a backdrop, but only a handful of the missions involve Jimmy actively fighting to neutralize the preps, which is suddenly on his agenda now despite what he told Gary. Speaking of Gary, he makes his final appearance before the end of the game during one of the prep missions where he's shown whispering into the head prep's ear to turn the preps against Jimmy. It goes to show he's getting better at his manipulation game by working over people who lack as strong of a constitution as Jimmy. This comes to an end though when Jimmy earns the respect of the preps by showing up to their boxing gym and individually whipping all their asses several times over. Really, Chapter 2 is meant to act as another conduit for the developers to deliver more of those iconic childhood moments. Going to the movies and getting stood up by your date, taking your date out to the carnival, egging houses, and bike races with other kids. It's pretty clear that the passion came from the concepts themselves. The main narrative of the now established Jimmy v. Gary conflict just doesn't get the same priority, and having that conflict out of the way for most of the missions dilutes it a lot before it even gets going. Had Rockstar taken the time to reinforce this new rivalry during this chapter and let it fall into the background during the later chapters, the story would have had more inertia to keep the story feeling well composed. But because they opted to sideline it immediately, the central conflict gets lost and the story starts to feel like it's meandering. Chapter 3 introduces Winter Bullworth, which is an awesome flip of the map with all the snow everywhere. The slums of New Coventry open up and now it's the Greasers' turn to get in Jimmy's way. This conflict is more woven into the chapter than the Preps' involvement in the previous, and as a result the chapter feels better constructed. Gary is absent entirely from this chapter and this is just about Jimmy trying to neutralize the Greasers. We start off helping them and their leader, Johnny Vincent, who is constantly having issues with his girlfriend Lola. Lola is, in no uncertain portrayal, a manipulator of the highest degree and a bit of a floozy. She's constantly flirting with the different guys from different cliques, and she even seduces Jimmy at one point. Johnny's concerns are well-founded, and the missions all involve this weird love triangle that turns into a clusterfuck that even includes algae at one point. All the free lovin' naturally leads to jealousy on Johnny's part, where he tries to pull a Gary and take Jimmy out. These being the Greasers, and the fact that they lured Jimmy into a scrapyard leads me to believe Johnny was probably angling for a more permanent solution here, and was probably going to bury Jimmy under a stack of cars or something. Pete makes an appearance here and is able to commandeer the crane to eliminate Johnny's bike and get them to fight on more even footing. In terms of this game's boss fights, this was one of the better ones because it involves having to neutralize Johnny's goons while dodging Johnny and his bike at the same time. Once that's done, we just gotta beat him in a straight fight, which is appropriately difficult because Johnny is big, has a lot of health, and packs a punch. Once he's down and Jimmy tells him how he doesn't care about Johnny's sloppy seconds, Johnny figures Jimmy is alright and now he's cool with the Greasers. In the original game, Christmas was marked by a special mission that just has Jimmy getting summoned to the office where a package from his mom is awaiting him. It's an ugly reindeer sweater that's tonally appropriate, and coupled with all the decorations around school, this seems like a good enough acknowledgement of the holiday. In Scholarship Edition though, they added a bunch more Christmas-related missions. Most of them involve us doing the bidding of some homeless alcoholic walking around town in a Santa suit. The story goes he lost his job doing Santa pictures with the kids, probably because he was an alcoholic, and now he wants his old hustle back so he can make some quick cash. There's no sugarcoating it, these missions are just awful. I suspect they were originally cut from the main game and were just restored and polished, I use that term loosely here, to be added back in. The results are not great. The cutscenes are amusing, but there's only so many times I can pretend to laugh at someone's troubles before I start to feel like a real piece of shit. These missions just don't fit well with the story or the pacing, and worse yet, the missions themselves are tedious and buggy. Another mission has Jimmy saving the day for the music teacher by performing a few Christmas carols in the school musical, but relies on the dull music class minigame for the gameplay part. The cutscene with the teacher is funny, and so is the awful musical itself that reminds me of my own experiences in my middle school band. That's all the mileage we're gonna be getting out of this one. Other than that, we get a few more non-story bearing missions similar to the ones in Chapter 2. One has us complicit in the school cooks' scheme to drug the science teacher so she can perform non-consensual acts upon him.
It's about time I show you what I know about chemistry. And a little biology.
Another has us working for the alcoholic English teacher, Mr. Galloway, to get even with the math teacher, Mr. Hattrick, who is angling to use Galloway's drinking problem to get him fired. This mission is pretty neat, involving us tailing the math teacher to his fancy home and then vandalizing a bunch of shit to prove something. Jimmy's a kid and, this was his plan, so you can't exactly expect a whole lot of forethought. He just saw his English teacher getting bullied and wanted to step in and stop it. Missions like these help show the two sides of Jimmy and give the faculty a chance to display their unique personalities. All in all, they're pretty good. Chapter 4 begins, and now it's spring. The snow is gone and green is returning to Bullworth. I'm a little sad to see winter go, but Bullworth does look better when the trees have leaves and the already muted color palette isn't dominated by gray skies and white grass. This chapter is a 2-for-1 deal with the nerds and the jocks both playing a role. In terms of total missions, this one clocks in lighter than the others so far, but all the missions are relevant to the main conflict between Jimmy and the nerds, and then Jimmy and the nerds versus the jocks. So it actually feels the most congruent of the chapters. As a result, and also because almost all the missions of this chapter are well thought out from a gameplay perspective, this is probably my favorite of the chapters. This chapter starts with Jimmy having to take down the nerds in their fortified stronghold in the observatory at the back of the campus after they rebuffed his request for their help against the jock menace. This might actually be my favorite mission in the game because it introduces a spud cannon, and also because the mission is fun, well structured, and the boss fight against Ernest is more than just a straight up fist fight, playing to the trappings of what a nerd clique should be like. With them successfully pacified and allied, Jimmy and Ernest begin conceiving ways to bring down the jocks. I actually like Ernest. He's similar to Gary, minus the sociopathy. He comes up with a lot of the plans, and that leaves the execution up to Jimmy. But unlike Gary, Ernest has a clique with many resources and employs those resources in the war against the jocks. This dynamic is another reason why I love this chapter so much. It genuinely feels like there's a great conflict going on between the two opposing factions and gives me flashback to Fallout New Vegas. Of course, it's nowhere near as intricate as that game, but it doesn't have to be. It's enough to sell the idea that these cliques are more than just window dressing and operate with some autonomy of their own that leads to large-scale conflicts. Every main mission of this chapter is worth at least mentioning, so I'm gonna go down the list. Following the pacification of the nerds, the jocks launch an assault of sorts on one of the nerd hangouts at the carnival. This mission has us going to the funhouse in the carnival and rescuing the trapped nerds. Once again, this is a very creative mission that involves us navigating a funhouse and its many obstacles, and then weaponizing those obstacles to defeat the infiltrating jocks. Following that, Ernest comes up with an idea to defame the head cheerleader. This requires us to infiltrate the girls' dorm, which involves using stealth. This mission was a pain in the ass because the game doesn't really have stealth mechanics, so the designers had to make do with what they got. Defender of the Castle has the jocks retaliating and trying to storm the nerd hideout. We gotta coordinate a defense with the nerds against the jocks, and this is another fun mission that leans heavy on the combat mechanics and all the cool toys the nerds got, like their spud cannon turret. It's a lot of fun, but the turret sequence is a little bit undercooked. The next mission has us working for the jocks, surprisingly enough, to help that cheerleader from earlier, even more surprisingly. Jimmy finds her bummed out in the gym, all deflated because these skimpy pictures Jimmy took of her are posted all over town. Yeah, she's a colossal bitch, but she's been served a big slice of humble pie by the experience, and Jimmy being Jimmy, offers to go take care of the posters for her. This is more trouble than it sounds because one of the nerds keeps going around posting new pictures after Jimmy covers one up. It kinda got annoying racing around trying to beat him to the punch and cover all of them so the mission will complete, but I'll take one lame mission for all the great ones we've been getting. Also worth pointing out how a bunch of creepy adults are looking at these posters of a teenage high school girl. Yeah. Anyways, once that's taken care of, the cheerleader gives Jimmy a kiss, and now she likes him. The final 3 story missions revolve around Ernest's master plan to ruin the jocks' football game. The first step is for Jimmy to acquire the school mascot uniform, which involves fighting the bull in the empty pool next to the gym, which is a lot tougher of a fight than I'd expected. It was a boss fight in of itself, but with the suit, Jimmy can disguise himself so he can infiltrate the area around the gym and football field to carry out a series of sabotages the nerds need help with. The final mission has us running around performing little tasks like putting glue all over the benches, swapping their football with an explosive dummy, pissing in their punch, and reprogramming the scoreboard for that psychological warfare. Meanwhile, we gotta try to avoid the jocks because if they catch Jimmy, we gotta perform the timeless Bullworth Bull Dance, which is a brief QTE to distract the jocks. Once all this is done, Ted, the head jock, starts asking who is in the suit and why are they screwing with their game. Once Jimmy reveals himself, the final boss fight of the chapter kicks off, and it's the most elaborate fight we've seen yet. The first stages involve us dodging explosive footballs the jocks got from somewhere. I'm not sure if they made them themselves or if they found a nerd stash. But we gotta catch them and throw them at Ted's bodyguards while fighting off random jocks who come onto the field to fight us. Once that's done, we gotta start lobbing bombs at Ted until he goes rampant and charges at Jimmy. By that point, he's weak enough that even one hit will take him down, completing Jimmy's conquest of the school and all the cliques. Pete is happy, and this leads into the 5th and final chapter. But before that, I also want to cover a couple of the non-story missions in this chapter because they're also pretty good.
I think I have
finally caught the essence of what it means to be a banana. I really feel my work is moving forward.
Here's the thing. Art is lost on me. I've always been more into music.
The first one is a simple fetch and delivery quest, which, okay, not great, but the cutscenes involving Jimmy and the spicy art teacher are great. He thinks he's about to go on a date with the teacher, only to find out she's in a relationship with Galloway. Jimmy gets his hopes and dreams crushed, and this leads into the next mission. Mr. Hattrick apparently guilted Galloway into checking into the asylum to sober up. Ms. Phillips is concerned for Galloway, but can't get to him because Hattrick told the orderlies not to let her in, stating she was a bad influence on him. She asks Jimmy to bust Galloway out, which is an audacious task that Jimmy is quick to accept. This involves sneaking about, which, once again, isn't this game's strong suit. Fortunately, the environment of the asylum more than makes up for the mechanical shortcomings. Once we get to Galloway, we are treated to a brief cutscene where Jimmy convinces him to leave the facility. And I guess this is one of those places that allows patients to check themselves out because we just stroll out of the main gate in the following cutscene, reuniting the two lovers. Now we enter the final chapter, which starts with Jimmy as the head of the school. The first cutscene shows him being a pretentious, self-absorbed douchebag who is letting the position get to his head, which really puts PD out, who keeps reminding Jimmy that Gary is still out there. Jimmy ignores this though, figuring he's now untouchable and there's no need to worry about Gary. The heads of the cliques all put Jimmy up to graffitiing Town Hall to let everyone know he's the boss, which is a plan that only makes sense in the minds of short-sighted kids. So we go down there and do it, having to dodge police who understandably don't take too kindly to kids tagging up government buildings. And when we make it back to campus, PD is there to break the bad news. While Jimmy was gone, all hell broke loose. PD isn't sure why, but all the cliques are super pissed off and are back to beefing with each other and really pissed off at Jimmy, who'd been promising to everyone how with him in charge, there's meant to be peace between the cliques. PD figures it's got to be Gary behind this new batch of problems, but for now, Jimmy is essentially back to square one with his reputation with all the cliques brought back down to zero. The next few missions are about bringing stability back to the campus. Rats are infesting the library, the gym is on fire, Johnny was sent to the asylum, and the preps had their trophies stolen from their clubhouse. We have to go around rectifying all these problems by getting rid of the rats, saving from jocks from the burning building, breaking Johnny out of the asylum in a similar fashion to how we got Galloway out, and heading down into the Blue Skies Industrial Park and investigating the townies and get evidence that they were the ones who stole and destroyed the trophies. This mission reveals that all the chaos in campus was caused by the townies, most of whom are past students of Bullworth that either failed out or got kicked out over the years. They all got it in for Bullworth and its cliques, and Jimmy suspects this is Gary's doing to undermine his hold on the school. Naturally, nobody believes or really cares about Jimmy saying it was Gary and the townies and continue on hating Jimmy's guts. Jimmy winds up meeting a friendly townie by the name of Zoe. She used to go to Bullworth but got kicked out after complaining about Mr. Burton being a creep and hitting on her. Jimmy agrees to help her exact revenge on him by using a lawnmower and bolt cutters to dislodge a porta potty the gym teacher frequents during his morning runs in the park.
Oh my God! Corn! I didn't have corn for dinner! Oh, this is awful! Oh, 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 yuck! God damn, I stink! I'm gonna have to shower for days with bleach! Ah! This is worse than when I got hazed!
Zoe's friendship with Jimmy will come in handy for Jimmy's plan to deal with the townies because Jimmy's getting expelled. Turns out, Gary has been working over Dr. Crabblesnitch as well, and has managed to pin the blame on Jimmy for a lot of stuff. The two of them get into a huge argument when Crabblesnitch makes his decision. They haven't been able to contact his mother, but Jimmy is now forbidden from wearing the uniform or attending classes. With the help of Russell and Zoe, we're able to infiltrate an old chemical plant. Russell uses a police bike he managed to steal to bust through the front gates, while Zoe escorts him through the lines of security the townies put up. After a brief chase through the plant, Jimmy faces off against Edgar. This is the hardest boss fight in the game because Edgar is by far the toughest opponent we've seen yet, and he uses a pipe to beat on Jimmy. We gotta use some metal paneling to act as a shield, which is awkward, especially with the lock-on controls, and I was really not a fan of this fight. It eventually leads to the second phase where we gotta grab a pipe ourselves and duel Edgar. What's most annoying is if Edgar gets even one hit in, Jimmy will likely get stun-locked as Edgar repeatedly wails on him until he's out of health and loses the fight. Fortunately, there's a checkpoint at the very start of the fight, but I had to repeat the shield phase a good 6 times before I finally barely eked out a victory. With Edgar defeated, he explains how he always hated the school and the students since he never got to attend, and that's why he's stuck living in the dumpy part of town. He mentions Gary, and Jimmy begins filling in the blanks and assumes Gary was telling him all the same bullshit he was telling Jimmy about taking over the school. Once they both realize who the real enemy is, they agree to join forces to stop Gary once and for all. Now comes the mission I always see people bring up, the riot at Bullworth. Jimmy runs into Zoe in the trailer park, who tells him that the whole school is in complete mayhem. Jimmy grabs Edgar, some of his boys, and Russell, and they all storm the campus SWAT team style to restore order. All the kids are fighting each other, destroying the different clubhouses, and overall just tearing shit up. We gotta go around beating on all the cliques again one last time in back-to-back brawls while the whole campus is burning down around us. It's a very cool set-piece mission that has to have been inspired by the final chapter of San Andreas. While the events leading up to this felt quite rushed, especially in this final chapter, it still feels like an epic and mostly appropriate conclusion to all the chaotic events leading up to Jimmy's quest to bring peace to Bullworth. Gary finally materializes when Jimmy makes it to the main school building, which Gary has managed to take over in the chaos. Jimmy chases him to the roof of the building where the final boss fight occurs.
The thing is, if I win, you're just another punk! You win, and you'll be sent away even quicker for beating up the head boy!
Why'd you do it, Gary?
Because I can! Because making little people like you and the morons who run this place eat out of the palm of my hand feels great!
But I never did anything to you!
You would've if I'd given you the chance! Face it, I'm smarter than you!
Oh, congratulations! You're smarter than me! You hate everyone and everyone hates you! Genius!
The head likes me! I tied him up, turned his dumb school into a battleground, got kids expelled unfairly, put several others into therapy, and he still likes me!
You're such a loser!
Well, at least my mom doesn't make her living on her back!
You're dead!
Whoa!
Crabblesnitch, having heard all that Gary said, promptly expels Gary and reverses Jimmy's expulsion. He also gives in to a list of things Jimmy wants, like getting Pete made head of the school, having Zoe readmitted to Bullworth, and firing Mr. Burton. Jimmy is hailed the hero of Bullworth, and he goes outside to a cheering crowd of students as Zoe runs up and gives him a kiss. It's a silly and campy end that, given all that we've seen from this game, is actually entirely appropriate and probably the best ending possible for it. There's a few other non-story missions, like finally getting Hattrick fired for all the grief he caused Galloway by revealing he's selling tests to the rich students, but this section is going super long already, and there's not a whole lot to those missions. Some of those missions don't even unlock until Chapter 6, which is just an infinite chapter that exists so we can wrap up all the side content we might have missed over the course of the game, and knock out any classes we still have to pass. If you use the timestamp to skip to this part, hey, welcome back. We're going to wrap up this by just talking about the story in general, and I'm going to go back to avoiding specifics. The story of Bully is a mixed bag. Tonally, I think it's absolutely perfect. I honestly can't say a bad word about the direction Rockstar Vancouver decided to go with its tone. It's just the right balance of humor, hijinks, and childhood nostalgia that perfectly meshes with the rest of the game and does a lot to soften what could have very easily turned out to be a dark, depressing, and controversial game about a very serious subject. With that said, let's start with the subject material, bullying. I did a retrospective on The Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion last year, and one of the expansions, the Shivering Isles, takes place in the realm of madness. In looking back, I wish I'd at least mentioned something about mental illness and its portrayal in the expansion, because there were more than a few people that actually brought that up in the comments. The problem was that it never even crossed my mind that people playing it might have some opinions on its use for mental illness as a source of entertainment and jokes in the DLC, and as a result, I didn't really pay much mind to what that DLC was actually saying about its subject matter. Enter Bully, which, I mean, it's in the title. There's no ignoring where this game is pulling its main ideas from. I was never bullied or anything in school. I guess I was one of the fortunate ones in that I kept to myself and people left me to my own devices. I'm sure there's plenty of people watching this video who experienced bullying in some form or another, and I'd definitely be curious to hear their thoughts on Bully. In lieu of that though, I did my own research and found a lot of positive feedback regarding this game from people who'd been bullied. A lot of the stories were similar in that those people were bullied when they were kids, and when this game came out, it helped them cope with what they were going through. They admired Jimmy and saw in him a person they wished they could emulate to some extent, someone who had the guts and the strength to fight back against people who sought to bring him down. They were glad he wasn't, at least in the story, a cruel piece of shit like Gary, and instead used his time and talents to defend people like Pete. They were glad the story played out the way it did and ended with a hopeful, redeeming conclusion that saw peace and justice win out against Gary's cruelness and the tyranny of the cliques. For a lot of people, that narrative is more than enough for them. Like I said, as someone who never had to deal with bullying, I can't really say how the messaging from the story could make me feel. I definitely see room where Rockstar could have made a more substantive take on the topic and not rely on the final chapter to tell us what this was all about, but I get they were dealing with a lot making this game. There's certain issues that result from a lot of underdevelopment in the characters though. I promised a while back we were going to address it, so let's bring it in. Ludonarrative dissonance. In case you're unaware, ludonarrative dissonance, which I'll just be referring to as L&D from here on out, is a proposed feeling that arises in the player when what's happening in the story does not match what the player is actually doing in gameplay. A favorite example is how in GTA 4, Niko Bellic is portrayed as a man haunted by his past actions during an unnamed war years back. But once the player gets control of Niko, they're free to run innocent people over and shoot cops for fun. The story and the gameplay fall out of harmony, and the player is meant to be confused and dumbstruck by this contradiction. People have taken to saying that any game that exhibits L&D is bad, and that developers should be doing everything possible to avoid L&D. When I first heard about L&D, it made so much sense that I was almost embarrassed for not having thought of it first. Needless to say, I've taken a lot of steps back from L&D since, to the point now that I just kind of cringe whenever I hear it brought up as a genuine shot at a game, because anytime someone claims developers should always avoid doing X and should be doing Y, I kind of just immediately start shaking my head. There's no definite way to make a game. It's all subjective, and it's really about how well a game executes its ideas and how committed to its design fundamentals the developers were. Bully can suffer a lot from L&D, like all Rockstar games, because at its core, Bully is an open-world sandbox game that doesn't seek to restrict the player a whole lot. The developers built a bunch of bullying mechanics in the game, like stuffing people into lockers and garbage cans, giving wedgies and swirlies, and players are free to walk up to anyone and attack them unprovoked. Of course, the story portrays Jimmy as a defender of the downtrodden who only fights those who picked on him or others, to the point that most of those bullying mechanics are never even used in the story. There's never a point where the game orders the player to stuff a little kid in a locker. Why are these mechanics even in the game then, if the story doesn't force it and there's no gameplay benefits to doing them? I honestly don't have an answer to that. It's possible they were designed and put in before the idea to change the tone of the game into something a little more upbeat occurred, but the developers decided to just leave them in. It's possible they were put in because it might seem odd that the game is called Bully but the player can't actually bully. Hell, it might have just been put in to piss off the people saying the game was a Columbine simulator. I don't really know, and all I can say is that this does open up the game to a lot of L&D, and there's bound to be people who latch onto that and criticize the game. It shouldn't surprise you to hear that I don't really care about the L&D factor from the bullying mechanics. I don't care because I don't really consider what happens in the free roam sandbox to be canon to the events of the game, because this is a video game. Certain things exist just for the sake of existing. Games require a certain level of suspension of disbelief, and even some imagination. It's not a tall ask from the game to have me take what I do in free roam with a grain of salt. It's clear free roam was made for my benefit, not for expressing the greater narrative and themes the development team were aiming for. So I wouldn't criticize Jimmy being able to give a random nerd a noogie as being poor writing. What I will say though is that Rockstar's ambivalence most of the time towards their subject matter does reflect on the story as a whole, even if they shaped up their message in the last mile. There are plenty of examples throughout the game of Rockstar using the subject matter for simple comedic effect. I won't get into specifics because of spoilers, but I'll just mention how every time Mr. Burton was on screen, I got a little uncomfortable. This is where genuine character arcs and development for some of the recurring cast would have helped a lot. Jimmy, for instance, doesn't really have a lot of development. His circumstances and status in the school changes, but Jimmy starts the game hating bullies and wanting to find a solution to Bullworth's problems, and while he succeeds in the end, he didn't exactly grow as a character. He hates bullying in the beginning and hates it at the end. Gary's development never makes it past the first chapter, and you can make the argument he didn't develop at all either. He just showed who he truly was and played that to the end. Pete remained exactly the same. I guess Crabblesnitch grew a little in how he saw Jimmy. Every other character remains entirely one note the entire game because they aren't characters, they are stereotypes with an avatar. Algie is the nerd who wets himself a lot. Chad, Darby, and all the other preps are pretentious snobs who remain that way till the end. The jocks barely get any lines on screen at all, so not a one in that bunch is going to get any development. I'm not asking for all 61 students to have some spiritual epiphanies that change who they are and shows them growing into better adults. I'm just asking for some even rudimentary development of some of the repeating cast. Does Jimmy ever find peace with his anger at the world? No, not really. He triumphs over Gary, that's his arc. Does Pete finally make friends with someone besides Jimmy? Nope. I could go on, but I think I've made my point. The problem with the lack of developments in its characters is that it makes Bully feel a lot less focused as a result. Most of the main story missions don't actually tie to the central conflict, that being Jimmy v. Gary. And without any sort of character development from the others we help and fight along the way, all these missions feel completely pointless from a narrative perspective, and only serve for the benefit of reinforcing the idea that we are playing as a kid in a dysfunctional school. There's a lot going on in Bully, but it never really leads anywhere. This is why things like character development, strong central themes, and messages exist, to give meaning to the narrative itself. I get why Rockstar wouldn't want to get tangled in a message about the use of force to achieve noble goals, which is another topic they indirectly broach but never tackle in Bully. But failing that, they could have at least given us something to make it feel like something's actually happening. What drives this point home, though, I believe, is the fact that bullying doesn't even come to an end when the story is complete. If Jimmy went through all of this to bring peace to the school, why are the bullies still picking on the weaker students? Why are the nerds and the jocks still at war with each other? Why do the greasers always fucking steal my bikes when I'm in their part of town? Why is the math teacher and Mr. Burton still teaching even though they were meant to be fired? There's a lot of inconsistencies between the story and the game world that just further dampens any sort of consequences from the main story. I could go on, but what was meant to be a brief overview and some bullet points about the story that on the one hand captured my heart and on the other bored and confused me grew a lot. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed my time playing through the story, even if a lot of the missions had dull structures and relied way too much on disposable mechanics and simple minigames. Despite never growing, a lot of the characters have a distinct charm to them that can nevertheless entertain. The cutscenes are almost always endearing and hilarious. Watching the seasons change between the chapters is very satisfying, and because of all those positives, I still feel like I walked away with something worth experiencing. I just hope that if there is a Bully 2, Rockstar takes a more serious stance with some of the subject matter and characters. Speaking of Bully 2, why don't we spend the last chapter of this video talking about the legacy of the game and the prospects of any kind of sequel to it. In terms of typical Rockstar sales numbers, Bully was a bit of an underperformer. For instance, San Andreas has sold somewhere around 125 million units, while Bully sold about 1.5 million on the PS2. Because this is the games industry, there's no solid sales figures for any of the other platforms, but it almost certainly hasn't done as well as San Andreas. And of course, GTA 5 is one of the highest grossing video games of all time, so yeah, Bully can't even hold a candle to those numbers. Despite that, Rockstar has stated numerous times that they want to make a sequel, and over the years, rumors and leaks have confirmed a Bully 2 has been in the works at least 3 times since 2006. The most recent claims stated that the game had been cancelled in 2017 so Rockstar could focus on Red Dead 2 and apparently GTA 6. There's reportedly a design document and even a script floating out there, and if the timelines are to be believed, the most recent cancellation would have meant Bully 2 was in pre-production for over a year before being cancelled. Projects get cancelled all the time, especially during pre-production. The fact Rockstar has cancelled it 3 times could mean a lot of things. It's possible they kept getting caught up in the development of their major titles like Red Dead 2 and GTA 5, and considering the scope and budgets of those titles, those became massive undertakings requiring all the development studios to step it up. Merely shelving the project might not have been an option when you consider the fact that a lot of the people working on the pre-production designs might not even be at the company come time to pull the project off the shelf. Depending on the plans, technology, and development landscape, it might be better to just simply cancel the thing entirely and try again later. There's also the possibility that marketing and sales teams ran numbers on what the proposed Bully 2 might do financially, and higher-ups decided to can the project instead of investing. It's possible the proposed designs just weren't appealing enough to a wide enough audience for the game to meet necessary sales. Or those pre-production designs just weren't creatively sound enough for development to continue. I get the feeling all of these and many other factors are what is playing into the limbo state of Bully 2. But I want to discuss why creatively Bully 2 has got to be a struggle to conceive. For starters, the team in Vancouver has been dissolved since the release of Bully 1, so I doubt there's many of the original developers even left at Rockstar. While I praise the hell out of what the Vancouver team did with Bully 1 with its tone, style, setting, and characters, the truth is that may have been lightning in a bottle. If Rockstar went, let's do Bully 1 but bigger and more polished for Bully 2, I don't think it would be met with the same amount of enthusiasm. What makes Bully 1 so special is just how unique it is. As well, the scope of the game was damn near perfect. The map wasn't too big or too small, the story didn't overstay its welcome, and the whole game lasts maybe 30 hours total for a first playthrough. It's a very digestible and unique game, making it bigger and longer would, in my opinion, only hurt it. That is, unless they seriously expand upon the gameplay and world elements in a sequel. I've been beating around the bush this whole video saying how they might want to do X or Y for Bully 2, so I'm gonna go on a limb and propose some concepts. Now, I don't live under the illusion that Rockstar is gonna watch this video and adopt these ideas. This is really just meant to explore the strengths the framework of Bully 1 created and where it can most effectively be expanded upon. This is really just a hypothetical analysis more than anything else. With that said, I still like to abide by certain realistic boundaries that always define game development. No team is capable of making radically different games all the time and having them be smashing successes. Even Bully 1 borrowed a good amount from GTA to build a reliable framework they could work within. Since Bully 1, Rockstar has established Red Dead Redemption as another major franchise, and there's a few concepts there that I believe can be translated to the Bully formula. First, let's talk setting. Prior to Red Dead Redemption, Rockstar always had a heavy bias towards urban environments for their settings. Even Bully is a largely urban setting. There were people who had major doubts that Rockstar could adopt to a rural setting with Red Dead. And then Rockstar came along and proved the doubters wrong by delivering a setting that, despite being almost entirely wilderness, still felt lively. More than that, they were able to build gameplay mechanics that actually gave the players ways to interact with that world. So the question becomes, could Bully 2 have a change of setting? As iconic as the boarding school setting was for Bully, does it have to be the exclusive setting for the entire franchise? Could we get a Bully without a Bullworth Academy? I think so, but I'm pretty sure plenty of people will disagree. What's interesting is that, according to a leak, that Bully 2 script I mentioned earlier actually took place at Jimmy's stepfather's house and the surrounding town over the course of a summer. If this is to be believed, then Rockstar themselves were playing with the idea of removing Bully from the school setting. Personally, I don't think the school setting ought to be abandoned entirely, but a compromise either using a more conventional grade school setup or a college setting might be a better solution. Don't remove the school setting entirely, but reduce its importance and use the headroom for more mission and player freedom. Going back to the Red Dead source, taking inspiration from its rural environments would be my next suggestion. Set Bully 2 in some small town somewhere that's surrounded by diverse wilderness the player can explore. This then introduces the question of, how do we translate Red Dead mechanics to a Bully setting? Things like hunting could be carried over entirely. Place horses with bicycles, dirt bikes, quads, and whatever else. The camp building of Red Dead 2 could almost be copied entirely, just design it to be a hangout in the woods the game's young characters frequent. There are a few gameplay elements that could use some expansion and refinement. The sleep and schedule elements could be expanded to have a more noticeable impact. If classes did come back, replacing the minigames with something less focused on player skill and more focused on character building would be better. Maybe through the introduction of things like stat-based skills that could be improved from classwork. More customization options for the player and their bikes, perhaps weapon modifications like swapping out the bands on the slingshot for improved damage, and as much as people cringe from crafting mechanics, the bully world seems like an appropriate setting for something like that to be added. For the story, all I'd say is more character development, and if the cliques return, let the player interact with them more and have them offer utility for the player beyond them being backdrops for story missions. With those changes alone, they could tell a more engaging story while still keeping the wide focus they had in the first game that gave the mission designers a lot of freedom to make unique missions. Whatever Rockstar ends up going with, I'd honestly just be happy to see a sequel to Bully. This game introduced many new ideas that are ripe for expanding and polishing. As it stands now, Bully is at risk of becoming a forgotten title as the shoddy ports get older and nothing new comes out from this franchise. I'll end this video with a bit of perspective. As of this recording right now, Bully has just turned 15 years old. If Jimmy Hopkins was real, he'd be 30 years old right now. Damn, does that make me feel old. As is always the case, this video grew to be twice the size of what I'd originally planned. It's one of those things that, even after outlining, as I write, I find more things I want to discuss in order to be as thorough as necessary. I'd like to cover more Rockstar games in the future, and I'll definitely be using this video as a template for those. So if I do tackle them, it should go smoother. Anyways, I got a Twitter and a Discord and all that stuff linked down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.